Welcome to the channel. Today we are looking at a real historical episode from the Korean War. One that did not make headlines at the time, but quietly influenced how air combat was understood and fought. This is a story about a specific decision, made in seconds, that altered the outcome of a deadly encounter in the sky. To understand why it mattered, we need to begin with the place where it happened. By the autumn of 1951, the Korean War on the ground had settled into a tense and exhausting stalemate. Major offensives had given way to limited advances, defensive lines, and prolonged negotiations that showed little immediate progress. Infantry units dug in, artillery fire became routine, and movement along the front slowed to a crawl. In the air, however, the war did not stagnate. Instead, it concentrated. Over northwestern Korea, a narrow stretch of sky became the focal point of an increasingly brutal struggle for control. Pilots called this area MiG Alley. It was not an official designation and never appeared on operational maps, but every aircrew in the theater knew exactly where it was. The corridor ran along the Yalu River, which marked the border between North Korea and the People's Republic of China. South of the river, United Nations aircraft were free to operate. North of it, they were forbidden to follow. This political boundary created a unique tactical environment where one side could disengage into sanctuary airspace while the other could not. From altitude, MiG Alley looked almost tranquil. The land below was a patchwork of farmland, villages, and winding roads. Nothing on the ground suggested that this airspace had become one of the most lethal environments for jet combat ever encountered. Yet, above it, aircraft met daily at extreme altitudes and speeds, where decisions were measured in seconds and mistakes were rarely survivable. This was not a battlefield defined by courage or aggression, but by altitude, energy management, and timing. By late 1951, the air war had become highly specialized. The United States Air Force depended heavily on B-29 Superfortress bombers to disrupt rail lines, bridges, and supply centers supporting North Korean and Chinese forces. These missions were strategically vital, but they came at a cost. The arrival of the MiG-15 fundamentally changed the balance. With its rapid climb rate and powerful cannon armament, the MiG could reach bomber formations quickly and inflict severe damage in a short time. The American response was the F-86 Sabre. Designed specifically to counter high-performance jet fighters, the Sabre emphasized speed, stability, and control at altitude. In a dive, it could match or exceed the MiG. Its roll rate and visibility were superior, giving pilots greater situational awareness. On paper, the two aircraft appeared evenly matched. In reality, their differences dictated how engagements unfolded. The MiG climbed faster and struck harder. The Sabre rewarded discipline and precise control. Neither aircraft tolerated mistakes. At these speeds and altitudes, a single misjudgment could not be corrected. There was no margin for error and no room for hesitation. Pilots who survived MiG Alley learned quickly that confidence could be dangerous. Survival depended on restraint, careful observation, and the ability to abandon instinct when instinct pointed in the wrong direction. Captain Daniel Harper understood this well. By the autumn of 1951, he had completed 26 combat missions over Korea. He was no longer inexperienced, but he was not reckless. He had seen capable pilots fail by pressing too hard or committing too early. MiG Alley did not reward boldness. It punished predictability. Harper had learned that staying alive required precise judgment and the willingness to accept uncomfortable choices. On the morning of the engagement, Harper launched as part of a 4-ship patrol assigned to provide high cover near the Yalu. The mission briefing offered no surprises. Weather conditions were favorable, visibility was excellent, and enemy activity was expected but not confirmed. Orders were clear and restrictive. Intercept hostile aircraft crossing south of the river. Do not pursue targets north, and avoid unnecessary risk. It was a standard mission in a non-standard environment. The F-86E climbed steadily through thin cloud layers, its General Electric J-47 engine producing a constant, familiar whine. Instrument readings remained stable as the aircraft ascended. At 41,000 feet, the Sabre reached its optimal operating altitude, where it handled best and retained enough speed to disengage if necessary. Everything appeared routine, and that alone was cause for concern. The sky above was unusually clear. Experienced pilots disliked such conditions. Clear skies favored attackers and left little room for surprise or concealment. Visibility extended for miles in every direction, making it easier to detect incoming aircraft, but also impossible to hide from them. In MiG Alley, clear weather often preceded contact. The radio transmission came without warning. "Bandits, multiple, high, 12 o'clock." Harper scanned the horizon. For a moment, there was nothing. Then he saw faint flashes of reflected sunlight. 12 MiG-15s were already above the American formation, holding altitude and shaping the engagement before it had fully begun. The MiGs remained high and deliberate, dictating the terms. As the American formation broke apart to gain speed and separation, Harper recognized the tactic immediately. The MiGs divided, some diving after the fleeing Sabres, while others stayed high. It was a vertical trap, and as the high MiGs rolled over toward him, Harper realized the rest of his flight was gone. He was alone. Write in the comments which city you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. This is the best support. And we move on. Every fighter pilot in Korea carried the rules with him, not as abstract guidance, but as habits reinforced by repetition and loss. These principles were introduced in training, reviewed in mission briefings, and confirmed by after-action reports that listed aircraft and names no one wanted to recognize. They existed for a reason. In jet combat, survival depended on recognizing disadvantage early and disengaging before the situation collapsed beyond recovery. Harper understood those rules instinctively. As the MiGs descended toward him from superior altitude, he glanced across his instruments with deliberate calm. Airspeed was healthy, but not overwhelming. The MiGs were converting height into velocity, gaining speed rapidly as they came down. In seconds, they would hold both positional and kinetic advantage. In that geometry, distance closed quickly and violently. The instinctive solution was to run south. Every pilot knew that escape vector by heart. Yet Harper dismissed it almost immediately. The MiGs were already too close, and their superior dive performance ensured they would intercept him long before he reached friendly airspace. Running would only delay the inevitable, stretching the engagement without changing its outcome. Turning horizontally offered no better option. In a flat turning fight, numbers mattered more than skill. 12 aircraft could cycle attacks indefinitely, rotating firing passes while forcing the defender to bleed energy with each evasive maneuver. One error, one moment of lost awareness would be enough. Harper knew that path ended with cannon fire. He evaluated the situation with methodical clarity. Fuel levels were sufficient. Ammunition was full. Altitude was diminishing rapidly. Every escape route led to the same conclusion. The advantage rested entirely with the MiGs. According to doctrine, this was a fight to be avoided at all costs. The problem was that doctrine assumed space to disengage. Harper no longer had it. The realization came quietly. The textbook described average engagements, not exceptional ones. It provided guidance, not certainty. Faced with a situation it did not account for, Harper understood that following it mechanically would not save him. If he was going to survive, he would have to disrupt the engagement before it fully formed. He reduced throttle. The response was immediate and unmistakable. Acceleration flattened, and the Sabre's nose rose slightly as the aircraft began to bleed speed at altitude. Every instinct argued against the decision. Slowing down in front of superior numbers contradicted training, experience, and common sense. In combat aviation, speed was protection. Speed was life. Behind him, the MiGs reacted almost instantly. Their formation tightened as pilots adjusted their approach angles. What moments earlier had been a calculated pursuit became something closer to anticipation. A slowing American aircraft suggested vulnerability, perhaps even panic. The MiGs pressed harder, committing fully to the attack. Harper was not attempting to escape. He was attempting to shape the fight before it could shape him. MiG-15 pilots were trained to exploit advantage decisively. Their doctrine emphasized aggression when holding altitude and numbers, trusting in superior climb rate and heavy cannon fire to overwhelm opponents quickly. They expected American pilots to dive away, extending the chase until disengagement or destruction followed. Harper intended to exploit that expectation. At extreme altitude, speed alone did not decide an engagement. Energy did. Altitude, velocity, and control authority formed a balance that could be manipulated, but only briefly and only with precision. Harper understood that whoever forced the other to mismanage energy would control the geometry of the encounter, regardless of numbers. He held steady, resisting every impulse to dive or break away. He watched closure rates carefully, noting how quickly the MiGs were compressing distance. By allowing them to commit fully, he invited them to convert too much altitude into attack, reducing their margin for correction. The distance closed rapidly. The MiGs were now fully invested in the pursuit, their pilots focused forward, anticipating a fleeing opponent who never fled. Harper felt the pressure building, the moment narrowing. The engagement had reached a point where hesitation would be fatal. This was the moment he had been waiting for. At approximately 36,000 feet, Harper committed to the decision he had already accepted could not be reversed. He pulled the control column straight back and brought the Sabre into a hard vertical climb. This was not a probing maneuver or a test of reaction. It was a deliberate attempt to force a resolution before the engagement collapsed on the MiG's terms. The Sabre's nose rose sharply, and the horizon vanished as the canopy filled with pale blue sky. G-forces increased immediately, pressing Harper deep into the seat. Airspeed bled away at a rapid rate, faster than in any normal climb profile. The aircraft was converting forward momentum into altitude with brutal efficiency, but the cost was clear and immediate. Within seconds, the Sabre began to shudder. Lift diminished as airflow over the wings degraded. Control inputs felt heavier, less precise. The aircraft was balanced on a narrowing edge between controlled flight and aerodynamic failure. At this altitude, there was no buffer. A stall would not be gentle or recoverable. Every instructor Harper had trained under would have rejected the maneuver outright. Standard doctrine warned against vertical climbs when outnumbered and under threat. The logic was sound. A climbing aircraft surrendered energy, initiative, and escape options. In most circumstances, it was a fatal mistake. Behind him, the MiGs followed without hesitation. From their perspective, the situation appeared resolved. They held superior altitude, greater numbers, and closing speed. The American fighter was climbing directly into their advantage. In a vertical contest, the MiG-15's climb performance and cannon armament should have decided the outcome quickly. Harper felt the engine note fluctuate as the aircraft approached the limits of usable lift. The controls softened further, and the Sabre's response lagged behind input. Peripheral vision narrowed under sustained G-load. The margin for correction disappeared almost entirely. There was no longer space for adjustment or reconsideration. This was the point of no return. At the apex of the climb, as gravity began to overcome lift and the aircraft's upward motion slowed to near zero, Harper initiated the maneuver he had prepared for from the start. He applied rudder and rolled aggressively, snapping the Sabre through a violent half-roll. The aircraft pivoted over the top, nose dropping sharply as it transitioned from climb to dive. The timing was exact. The MiGs, still committed to the vertical pursuit, carried too much energy to react. Their pilots had followed instinct and training, converting altitude into attack without preserving margin. As Harper's Sabre rolled and fell away, the MiGs surged past his position, overshooting the target they expected to destroy. 3 silver fuselages crossed his canopy in rapid succession, so close and fast that individual markings blurred into streaks of light. The MiGs were now below and ahead of him, their excess speed and reduced control authority preventing immediate recovery. In an instant, the geometry of the engagement inverted. Harper pushed the nose down deliberately, allowing gravity to accelerate the Sabre. Airspeed returned rapidly, restoring full control authority. The aircraft stabilized as it dropped through the vertical, the transition smooth despite the violence of the maneuver. The gun sight settled naturally as training replaced conscious calculation. For the first time since the engagement began, Harper was no longer reacting. He was positioned. He aligned the sight on the nearest MiG's tail as the distance closed. There was no hesitation, no excess movement. The conditions he had engineered existed for only a brief moment, and he used them immediately. He squeezed the trigger. The Sabre dropped through the vertical with increasing speed as gravity reclaimed full control of the aircraft. Airspeed returned rapidly, restoring stability and responsiveness almost at once. Harper felt the familiar weight of the controls settle back into his hands, the aircraft once again predictable and precise. The transition from near stall to full control happened in seconds. The gun sight steadied faster than expected, a product of both aircraft design and countless hours of training. Harper fired. All 6 50-caliber machine guns opened simultaneously. The recoil passed through the airframe as a steady vibration rather than a violent shock. Tracer rounds streamed forward in converging arcs, striking the MiG's rear fuselage. For a fraction of a second, there was no visible reaction. Then the aircraft ignited. Fuel burned instantly, and the MiG disintegrated in a sudden burst of fire and metal. Fragments of the aircraft tore away and spun outward as the MiG vanished downward, trailing smoke and debris. Harper did not follow it. In MiG Alley, fixation was fatal. The moment he confirmed the hit, his attention shifted elsewhere. The engagement was no longer linear. It had expanded in every direction at once. He rolled hard left and pulled back into the vertical plane. The sky had changed completely. Where moments earlier there had been structured spacing and predictable movement, there was now disorder. MiGs crossed his field of view at intersecting angles. Contrails cut through one another at sharp diagonals. Pilots reacted independently, abandoning formation discipline in favor of instinctive survival. One MiG flashed across Harper's nose, attempting a high-speed crossing shot. The angle was poor and the closure rate excessive. Harper fired a short, controlled burst, resisting the urge to hold the trigger down. Rounds struck the wing root. The MiG snapped into an abrupt roll, its nose dropping sharply as control was lost. It disappeared below, tumbling out of sight. The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions. Commands were shouted and repeated. Warnings cut off mid-sentence. Korean voices mixed with Russian accents, but there was no coordination. The vertical trap that had moments earlier favored the MiGs had collapsed into confusion. Without altitude separation and timing, numerical superiority meant little. Harper refused to enter horizontal turns. Every maneuver remained vertical. He climbed only enough to threaten, then dropped back down, forcing MiGs to react defensively rather than plan attacks. Each defensive response cost them energy. Each loss of energy reduced their options. Another MiG attempted to reverse above him, misjudging closure speed and control authority. Harper rolled beneath the aircraft, reversed direction smoothly, and fired as the MiG struggled to recover. Smoke poured from the fuselage. Seconds later, fire followed. The aircraft fell away uncontrolled. 3. Less than a minute had passed since Harper fired his first burst. The engagement had compressed into a violent, accelerated sequence of decisions where hesitation had no place. The sky was now filled with debris and smoke. visual markers of aircraft that had been intact moments earlier. A fourth MiG attempted to disengage by climbing away, choosing altitude over aggression. Harper followed briefly, not to pursue a retreating aircraft, but to force a choice. Near the top of the climb, the MiG slowed. Its wings began to tremble as lift decayed. Harper reversed cleanly, dropped in behind, and fired. The MiG stalled, rolled inverted, and fell. 4. The airspace was now chaotic. Burning fragments spiraled downward. Trails of smoke marked the paths of destroyed aircraft. The remaining MiGs scattered in multiple directions, no longer operating as a unit. Some dove away at high speed. Others turned north toward the Yalu. Coordination was gone. One final aircraft accelerated south, diving past Harper's nose and abandoning the engagement entirely. Harper tracked it briefly, then let it go. His ammunition counters were nearly empty. Fuel reserves were dropping. Pursuit would have offered no advantage and significant risk. The fight was over. In less than 90 seconds, 5 MiG-15s had been destroyed. One American F-86 Sabre remained airborne. As Harper turned away from MiG Alley, the sky returned to silence, giving no indication of what had just occurred. Only after Harper turned south did the physical consequences of the fight begin to surface. During the engagement, his attention had been entirely consumed by airspeed, angles, and timing. Now, with no immediate threats on the horizon, his breathing slowed unevenly, and his hands trembled slightly on the controls. The surge of adrenaline that had carried him through the encounter drained away, replaced by a heavy, delayed awareness of fatigue. The Sabre itself gave no indication of the violence it had just endured. As Harper aligned with the runway, control inputs remained precise and predictable. Instrument readings were stable across the panel. Engine temperatures and pressures sat within normal limits. Structurally, the aircraft appeared intact. In the air, there was no visible sign that anything extraordinary had occurred. The wheels touched down smoothly, the landing uneventful. Harper brought the Sabre to a controlled stop and shut down the engine. Only then did the full stillness of the airfield register. The contrast between the controlled calm on the ground and the chaos that had unfolded minutes earlier at altitude was stark. Ground crew members were the first to notice the evidence. Dark streaks of cordite stained the fuselage around the gun ports. Ammunition counters showed empty. The paint along the nose was scorched and discolored by sustained firing. These were not the markings of a routine patrol. Something out of the ordinary had taken place. Word spread quickly among maintenance crews and pilots on the flight line. No one asked questions aloud, but the condition of the aircraft spoke clearly enough. The Sabre had returned alone, and it had expended nearly all of its ammunition. That combination was rare in MiG Alley and rarely benign. In the debriefing room, Harper delivered his report without emphasis or embellishment. He spoke calmly and methodically, structuring his account around facts rather than impressions. He listed altitudes and headings, described closure rates and maneuver sequences, and specified firing intervals. He avoided interpretation and speculation, focusing only on what he had done and what he had observed. When Harper finished, the room remained silent. It was filled with experienced men, pilots with combat tours behind them, intelligence officers familiar with MiG tactics, and squadron commanders who understood the statistical reality of air combat in Korea. All of them knew MiG Alley. All of them understood the odds involved in engaging multiple enemy fighters, particularly from a position of disadvantage. Finally, one officer spoke. His tone was neutral, not accusatory. "You climbed into them?" The question was not rhetorical. It was an attempt to confirm what the report seemed to describe. Harper nodded once. There was no defensiveness in his response. When the officer followed with, "That's not doctrine," Harper paused briefly before answering. His reply was measured and precise. Doctrine didn't fit the situation. It was not a justification, only a statement of fact. Gun camera footage settled the matter. Reviewed frame by frame, it showed MiGs overshooting in the vertical, firing passes intersecting empty sky, and impacts blooming across silver fuselages at close range. The sequence confirmed 5 destroyed aircraft. The Sabre itself showed no combat damage. The engagement was documented, verified, and recorded. The report was classified. There were no press releases or public acknowledgments. The war continued without pause, and individual actions did not alter official narratives. Yet the story spread anyway. Pilots discussed it quietly in hangars and briefing rooms. They talked about energy management, vertical geometry, and overshoot dynamics. No one attempted to replicate the maneuver exactly. The conditions were too specific, and the margin for error too narrow. But something had shifted. Assumptions were questioned, and in MiG Alley, that alone mattered. The engagement was examined in detail in the days that followed, stripped deliberately of emotion, exaggeration, and personal narrative. There was no attempt to frame it as a duel or a feat of individual daring. Analysts approached it as a problem in applied air combat, focusing on aircraft performance, pilot behavior, and decision-making under extreme pressure. What mattered was not the outcome itself, but why it had occurred. The MiG-15 emerged from this analysis not as a deficient aircraft, but as a highly capable one. In many respects, it held clear advantages over the F-86 Sabre. It climbed faster, reached higher altitudes with less effort, and carried significantly heavier armament. Its cannon were designed to destroy bombers with minimal firing time, and in the vertical plane, the aircraft could dominate opponents who mismanaged speed and altitude. Yet those advantages were conditional. At very high speeds, the MiG's control forces increased sharply, making precise maneuvering more difficult. Its roll rate lagged behind that of the Sabre, limiting rapid lateral repositioning. Rearward visibility from the cockpit was restricted, complicating defensive awareness once an opponent passed behind. These were not flaws in design, but trade-offs made to prioritize climb and firepower. Equally important was doctrine. MiG pilots were trained within a system that emphasized decisive aggression when holding advantage. Altitude and numbers were meant to be converted quickly into destruction, not prolonged maneuvering. The expectation was clear. An outnumbered opponent would disengage, dive away, or attempt escape. When that expectation was violated, the doctrine offered little guidance for restraint. Harper's actions exploited this doctrinal rigidity. By deliberately reducing speed, he disrupted the MiG's sense of timing and forced them to close too rapidly. By climbing vertically, he invited pursuit in a regime where commitment carried consequences. By refusing horizontal turns, he denied the MiGs the sustained firing solutions their weapons required. Each pilot reacted independently, converting collective advantage into individual vulnerability. At that point, the engagement ceased to be about numbers. Numerical superiority only mattered as long as coordination held. Once timing collapsed and spacing vanished, the fight reduced itself to relative position and energy. Geometry replaced force. Angles, closure rates, and altitude differences became decisive factors, outweighing numerical strength. Overshoot was the critical moment. Once MiGs passed the Sabre at excessive speed, their advantage evaporated instantly. Recovery required time, space, and altitude, none of which were available. What appeared externally as reckless behavior was, in fact, a controlled manipulation of energy states, applied at a moment when doctrine offered no defensive answer. There was no heroism embedded in the maneuver. It was not an act of bravado or defiance. It was calculation under constraint. Harper did not attempt to outfly 12 opponents. He engineered a situation in which they briefly outperformed themselves. The result was not spectacle, but inevitability once conditions aligned. Harper did not become a public figure. There were no interviews, no ceremonies, and no official recognition beyond routine confirmation of results. He completed his tour, returned home, and resumed a life far removed from MiG Alley. Like many fighter pilots, he carried his experiences without display or explanation. Among pilots, however, the lesson endured, not as a maneuver to be copied or a tactic to be replicated, but as a reminder that doctrine described the average engagement, not the exceptional one. Rules provided structure, not certainty. They were tools, not guarantees. MiG Alley remained lethal until the armistice in 1953. Aircraft continued to fall, and pilots on both sides continued to die. Yet for 90 seconds in the autumn of 1951, one pilot confronted a situation doctrine did not anticipate and made a decision it did not prescribe. For that brief interval, the sky belonged to him. This concludes our examination of a real air combat engagement where discipline, timing, and understanding of limitations proved more decisive than numbers or aggression. The episode reminds us that history is often shaped by quiet decisions made in moments of extreme pressure. Thank you for watching and for your interest in carefully documented historical events. Subscribe to the channel to support our work, and we'll see you in the next episode.